Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. This is a Mythmakers sidecast, an author's journey through Lord of the Rings. And I'm guiding you. My name's Julia Golding. Now, I'm an author and I've always admired Tolkien's artistry as a novelist. And so doing this, I'm really looking at it from the point of view of him as he writes it. And we've reached in our adventure, in our quest, Chapter 9 in Fellowship of the Ring, which is called At the Sign of the Prancing Pony. And this is one of the shorter chapters in Fellowship of the Ring. And the structure is that we have an introduction, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Then we have the hobbits meeting Harry, the gatekeeper, at the gate. Then they go to the Prancing Pony and they have supper in a room on their own. And then they take the disastrous decision to go into the main public bar, into the tap room of the inn. And a lot of things happen in that last phase in this chapter. But I want to pause here on how this starts. It's quite an unusual start to a chapter because Tolkien spends a long time telling us about where Bree and the associated villages of Staddle, Coombe and Archet are, so much so that you can actually draw a map as a result of this. It's very complete. I think it's almost the most complete description of a location until we get to possibly Minas Tirith, which has another moment of pausing when we get a sense of the wider area around Minas Tirith. And this place, Bree, we find out from the appendices, is actually based on a Buckinghamshire village called Brill, which is a short drive from Oxford. And that is a village on a small hill with a windmill, and it is surrounded by associated villages. And it's also got lots of woods around there. I drove out there during the pandemic, during lockdown. It was one of the areas where we could go within our sort of allowed area and had a good old ramble around it. But one of the things that made it a source for Tolkien was the name. He actually took quite a few cues from the villages around that part. If you're thinking of where Oxford is, it's the area to the east of Oxford. To the west, you've got the beautiful area called the Cotswolds, and over in the east, it's less famous, less visited, much more of a place known to locals. So it has that, I don't think it would be on most itineraries of people investigating the roots of Tolkien, but it's a pretty little village, well worth a detour from the M40. The thing that brought Tolkien to that area is it got some interesting names. So even the name of Brill and Bree, they're connected to the word for hill. And its name is meant to sound Celtic or other to the names in the Shire. So if we think of the Shire names as being sort of more of a contemporary English, it's meant to sound as though it's from a different tradition. And I don't know if you ever realised this, but in the appendices, if you've read that far, there's actually quite a long discussion that Tolkien has about how the Hobbit language that he uses is a translation from another language, which looks quite exotic and strange if you actually see the words he puts down for the Hobbit language. So the idea is he's translated it from Hobbit, if you see what I mean, into English. And other languages are then referenced against that. So there's another thing that might be worth knowing about Bree and Brill is that Brill is about the same distance, more or less, as a good long walk from Oxford, several days' walk. So it feels about the right distance from Oxford as the hobbits have come from the Shire with all their many delays on that journey in the Old Forest and with Tom Bombadil. So it feels like a good place for him to think, well, what's that distance from where I'm sitting writing this? So you can see how it may have all gone into that sort of stew pot of his mind, and out pops Bree. And he describes it with such a accuracy. This is there, that's there, Archet's in the woodland, that you really feel he believes in its existence, which means you as a reader do too. And if you're wondering, if you found it a bit confusing, when I was thinking about this, I have a book of Tolkien maps, but I also found much more easily accessible is if you just go on the Wikipedia page for Bree, you'll see a really excellent map which describes how the roads and the villages all interrelate. So do check that out when you're reading this chapter. The other thing this introductory piece emphasizes is how Bree is an island in a wilderness. And this makes you realize how the Shire is such an exceptional country. It's got its postal services and its farthings and, you know, it's sort of petty bourgeois hobbit life of pubs and parties. Bree seems to be a very different place, even just on that level. It's much more isolated, much lower population compared to the Shire. And there is a feeling that we have passed the golden age, that the landscape is empty, the roads are abandoned, and we are entering into almost stepping back in time in a way by leaving the Shire. He says that the Bree men belong to nobody but themselves. Tolkien in his letters described himself as having anarchistic leanings. That's his ideal he wants to get rid of big government and interference. And he has a liking for small self-governing communities, which of course the Shire itself is that his most sort of extended idea about that. But you get a version of that in Bree as well. And this gives the theme that keeps coming up in Tolkien. Have you noticed it? The theme of the survival of small people as great waves of history come and go. I mean, they're also literally small. You've got the Druidan, who we meet in the forest much later when Theoden rides to Minas Tirith. We've got the hobbits themselves. And now the Bree men are also described as being short of stature. In contrast to these smaller people who don't get so cool, you know, they're not the tall poppies cut down by history. We get a glimpse of the Rangers. And this picks up on the vision of the last chapter, which Tom Bombadil prompts. And of course, stretches forward to the main encounter in this chapter, which is with Aragorn, known at this stage as Strider. But let's have a think, what is happening in this intro? There's been quite a long moment now where we're basically getting a geography and history lesson about a place that we're not going to spend an awful long time. Who is telling us this? What is going on? So looking at it from an author's point of view, people often describe Lord of the Rings as a omniscient narrator, but it's not really, because it's explained that the book is written by Frodo with supplemented by the stories and recollections of his friends. So if we're going to go with that conceit, what's happening here is Frodo, way after the events of the tale, is writing this for the public record of his adventure, which he's going to hand on to Sam. And he feels that the reader, I imagine he's thinking hobbits, reader needs to know these things about the place that's outside their borders. So the narrator, let's assume it's Frodo, is stopping to tell us about that. That is obviously a game that Tolkien's playing, and he doesn't always keep to those rules, but that's how I understand this. Let's think about it. Otherwise, it's he's breaking the rules of narration by zipping around and doing different things. I think it all becomes a unity if you let that conceit run all the way through, that this is Frodo using the recollections of his friends to dramatize them and provide the information that we know, because he's very good at writing books. And one of the things that is emphasized in this introduction is that there is hobbits outside the Shire, more than Shire folk know. There's a little fascinating idea that they may be living like tramps, as well as the population in Bree. But the thing that challenges the hobbit expectations in Bree is they are here, the hobbits from the Shire, the hobbits in Bree are able to coexist with the big people, which is described as like a unique experiment. And it does influence our concept of the Shire and its limitation and its insularity. They feel that they are not part of everything else. And that will come up again in a minute when we get to the scenes in the inn. And it does pick up on something which is very true of village life in England, but I've met it in Italy and elsewhere. I imagine if you think of your own equivalent villages or regions in the country you're from, that you can have this sense of we are different from those people over there, even if there's only a field separating you, or a short stretch of road in this case. Another little thing before we move on back to the story, as it were, is the glimpse of old roads. We've got two intersecting roads here, which is why Bree is at this particular point. One called the Greenway, which suggests it's been overgrown and become green, i.e. the grass is growing up through the tracks. This, for me, is reminiscent of the fate of Roman roads in the history of England, which sometimes underlie main roads now, but sometimes get lost in the surrounds when they no longer connect points in the way that we do the travelling. And there was one, or is one, I should say, very close to Tolkien on Otmore, which is the place where he sets Farmer Giles of Ham. And it would be a place that he could easily motor to or walk to from Oxford. It's a great place to go bird watching. There's a wonderful bird sanctuary there. But running right across the centre of it is a green road, which is an old Roman road, which you can still walk along. And I always think of the Greenway when I'm walking along that. And another thing you might want to, because we are now heading past these roads to the inn itself, to the Prancing Pony. And when you sort of look online to see what people think about the Prancing Pony, there are those who attempt to identify it with a particular pub that has inspired Tolkien. There is actually a pub in Oxford, a well-known pub called the White Horse, right by Blackwell's. So if you're looking for a place with a white horse, quite a plump white horse on the sign, you don't have to go very far. But I think that would probably not be fair to Tolkien. I think he's thinking about all the pubs he knows, and by George, he knew his pubs, because in a way it's an amalgam of a very common part of village life. Certainly in his day, many pubs many villages had more than one pub. So it's capturing, I think, a cultural moment. There are less pubs now than there used to be, but still, there are still, if you come to the UK, or if you live here, you know that you can go and visit pubs very much like this without much effort. Anyway, back to the story. The first person that the hobbits meet after having said goodbye to Tom Bombadil is Harry the Gatekeeper, who I think is the first man they meet, if we think of Tom and Gandalf as not being men. And it's interesting that there's clearly mutual suspicion between them. And you get the sense that the hobbits' hackles are up. They feel something's not right. And Tolkien is giving us signals. He's shading that character to be on the villainous side because Harry stared at them darkly. So we're getting the signals here that this is not a person to be trusted. And we get an insight into Frodo's point of view. So we're at this stage in the narration more often in Frodo's head than anyone else. And that's where we stay for most of this. In fact, for all of this chapter. And we see that he's still hoping for Gandalf to turn up. There's one little odd moment here where when they go off into the village itself, the narrator, future Frodo, adds a little line about someone climbing the gate, unseen by Harry, unseen by the hobbits. And it's a dark figure. We're not told who it is. We later find out who it is. But because we don't know, it could be ominous, it could be bad, it could be a threat. So you never want in a narration to let everything just be this happened, this happened, this happened. It has to be shaded by some sort of tension or problem or ticking clock or something to keep you reading. And these suggestions that something is following them, hounding them, is one way of doing it. And when they reach the Prancing Pony, it's fun here that Sam is very unnerved by his first sight of all these stone houses that big to him that the men build, whereas Frodo is readier to accept Tom's recommendation that all is well in this particular case. There's an odd description here, which I just wanted to pause over, which is the sign, when that's mentioned, it's the Prancing Pony by Barlim and Butterbur. I wondered, I'll have to look this up, I wasn't sure if that means that the landlord, was that a common way of describing pubs, that they're by the name of the landlord? Doesn't seem quite right. I've never heard it in any other context. The other possibility, which I rather like and would be rather fun, is maybe he painted the sign. I would love to think of Barlim and Butterbur having a sideline where he goes away and paints. He's so proud of his pub, he actually even makes his own sign, because that would make sense of the sign being by him. But I suspect it's just meant to say that this is the name of the landlord. Okay, and then brace yourself, because this is where Tolkien shows his powers of dramatizing a scene through speech. That's how we do get a brief description of him, but really what we know most about Barlim and Butterbur is his breathless way of talking. It's short sentences, abrupt, moving on, always running after to somebody else's call, all brilliantly written here, very economically. He's a friendly man, and we're very clear that his agenda isn't the same as the hobbits. He puts the quest in perspective, and we get that again when we circle back round to Bree right at the end of the journey, where he's just thinking about the fact that his custom has been down and things aren't looking at it. So Tolkien's always keeping the perspective of the common man in this bigger magical quest. He is one of Tolkien's originals, the unheroic but rather fine people, along with Farmer Maggot, and later in Minas Tirith we meet Yorith, the loquacious lady in the Houses of Healing. He's clearly good-hearted, but probably a bit annoying, because we're thinking, why didn't you get to the point? These are important, why didn't you send the letter? All these things. So he can be a bit annoying. But the energy of his speech shows that he is a man of his community, and that particularly signalled not by him saying, I am a man of my community, but by him coming up with sayings and common wisdom. That's how he's very networked, we would call it now, in his community. And he reminds me of, in this case, Jane Austen. So one of the funniest characters in Emma, Jane Austen's wonderful novel, is Miss Bates, who is another powerhouse of language. And most people find her tedious, including Emma, the main character. But she is used with great verve and fun by Jane Austen as a way of seeing into scenes, because she will enter into a assembly room, for example, and describe everything from the decorations to the food on the table. So the author doesn't need to describe it. They've got a character who's doing it in a funny and amusing way. It reveals the character, it reveals the scene, it reveals the reactions of the other characters to her. But if you're reading carefully, you pick up clues, because she is giving little signals that you need to pay attention to. And you get this with Barlim and Butterbur, him saying about who's come up, that they have a party that's just come up the Greenway. We know who's in the tap room from him. So when they actually do go into the tap room, we don't need that to be reiterated. You already know there's some strangers there, there's the local hobbits, and there's the local men. And it's all been done by that outpouring of conversation of Butterbur wanting to tell you everything that's on his mind. He doesn't have much of a filter, I think we would say. Then we get when they're finally sitting down after having been through the scary time in the Barrow White and whatever, and all of that loneliness of the road, the suspicion at the gate, we now get one of those golden moments where they get a lovely feast of very plain and simple food, including a blackberry tart, which I quite like the sound of. And it reminds me that this was written in the tradition of still holding on to some of the children's fiction idea, that sort of Hobbit feel, as in from The Hobbit, which is could also be described as a series of memorable meals. And it has that air about it. It seems innocent. It seems comforting. So then why? As a reader, you're thinking, you're safe. Stay there. Don't do anything. Didn't you get the vibe from Harry? Didn't you get a vibe that someone may have climbed over the wall? But no. Whilst telling each other to be careful, they take the decision to leave that little haven. Most of them go into the tap room, and Mary says, I'm going to go and wander around outside. It's the equivalent of the person going into the haunted house. Don't do it. You can see there's going to be disaster. But that is the fun of narrative. You're winding up the reader because they know that something is going to happen. So once they get into the tap room, that's Frodo, Sam, and Pippin. They get a rush of names, which has a bit like, it echoes the party right at the very beginning. So this is the Bree version. And these names, because names are vital in the way Tolkien thinks about his world, gives you a sense of the slightly different culture. And the hobbits register that the way people name themselves there is unfamiliar. There are some familiars, but they find it odd that the men of Bree have botanical names, for example. And so botanical names also tell you what the local environment is, and it's very English. They're still within familiar climes. They haven't got any of the new flowers that you'll get later in Lothlorien and elsewhere. We also have a little insight here to something which has a very modern feel to it, which is the tension between the people who are coming up the road, the strangers, and the men themselves, the local people themselves. They're basically a kind of economic migrant asylum seeker. And the reactions are fascinating. So the local people are saying, well, yeah, sorry about it, but no room here, is their sort of vibe that they're giving. And as the hobbits don't think it affects them at all, which of course turns out to be disastrously wrong, because whilst they're away, Saruman moves in, takes over, builds sheds to house the men in the Shire. So it's a warning that these problems don't stay confined within borders. And I think if you remember, this is all being written during the Second World War, of which massive displacements of people in Europe, lots of refugees. You can see that this also had an echo of the situation that Tolkien was in at the time of writing. Then we move into the next section prior to the disaster. We get Pippin, who's having the time of his life telling stories. Pippin is regaling the locals with little funny anecdotes from the Shire. And whilst he's doing that, holding the attention, Frodo is intrigued by a stranger who's sitting in the corner. And this is, of course, going to be Aragorn, but we don't know that yet. And he's wonderfully introduced. It's just very economic. And note how many details of where he's come from and what he's doing are given by this brief description. Suddenly Frodo noticed that a strange-looking, weather-beaten man sitting in the shadows near the wall was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room he wore a hood that overshadowed his face, but the gleam of his eyes could be seen as he watched the hobbits. That is actually my favourite shot in the Peter Jackson film, where the glow of the pipe flares and catches in Aragorn or Viggo Mortensen's eyes, which is straight from this passage. So we get that he is a long, lean, well-travelled person who's set apart, who's not joining in, who's watching, who's listening. And if we've been paying attention, we might start to think, oh yes, what about those rangers? That sounds like a person who ranges about the place. And obviously on a second reading, you're already making the links. Frodo goes to talk to him. He's waved over, which I think it's an interesting choice by Frodo. Maybe he feels he couldn't be, it's maybe manners, because he's asked about him and then gets the beckon to go over. But he does take the risk to go over and just sort of sound out this person who's watching him. And what he hears is very disturbing, because there's some very heavy hints dropped here by Strider that he might know who he is. He says, Master Underhill, if old Butterbird got your name right. So still on a first reading, we're not sure if this is a friend or a foe. But he does point out that Pippin is going too far. So Pippin has moved into the story of Bilbo's farewell speech, which is obviously where this whole book begins. And Frodo takes alarm that he might even go as far to mention the ring. And Strider urges him on to make an intervention. And this is where we get evidence that Frodo too is someone who is a bit of a performer, because after a slow start, he sings the song about the man in the moon. Now, let's have a little pause here to think about Tolkien as a poet. There's a wonderful new 3-volume edition of his collected poems. And reading through the introduction to that, I was reminded that this poem was actually written for a context outside of the book. It was started way back, a version of it was started way back in 1919, where he was having fun with the idea of tracing the roots of nursery rhymes, because this is based on a well-known nursery rhyme, expanding it and giving it a sort of another lineage. So he'd already written this poem, and when he was thinking for a song that Frodo could sing, he thought, oh, well, this fits because this is the time, it could be the time when before the nursery rhyme was shortened. He's almost inventing the history by putting it into Middle-earth. So he's continuing this joke that he began in 1919 in this book several decades later. I actually think it's quite a good, fun piece of nonsense verse. If you want to hear it sung, Andy Serkis has a go in the audio version. But I personally rather like the version in the BBC radio drama, which was done by Brian Sibley back in the 80s. It's actually really good. So and Ian Holm is singing it as Frodo. So I would recommend going and having a listen to that. What's particularly good about it is the way it builds, so that you can see it would give a cheer at the end if you were listening to it in a pub and they want to join in. I didn't like the version that was done. It was borrowed for The Hobbit, and the dwarves sing it as part of their sort of disruption. Yeah, I think in Rivendell. I didn't like that. It's much better in this context, so don't bother to go and watch that version. And here we get a sense of the power of the ring, because Frodo he's nervous. The ring knows that. He's got this nervous habit of playing with the ring, and it slips on his finger in an unguarded moment and betrays him. And I think it's really strongly felt here that Frodo feels an utter fool. Shame and feeling foolish is actually a really powerful emotion to put in a story, because we all know that. We probably agonize over things we do far longer than anybody else would remember them. And that's how Frodo feels. I think he's not even aware of the danger he's put himself in. Aragorn is, but Frodo is just thinking, I have been an utter idiot. His reaction is very relatable. And also the embarrassment of, how do I come back from that? Strider is quite unsympathetic here. He just basically, a bit like Gandalf telling Pippin that he's a fool of a toque. There's a kind of Strider asperity here. But it does mean that Frodo, in his sort of embarrassment, does agree to an interview with Strider to kind of have it out with him in private. And Frodo tries to do what is the equivalent of clean up on aisle 5 by saying, of course, he isn't a magician. He just crawled away under the table. No one buys it. And poor old Mr. Butterbur has to come in and try and, make peace with his regulars. And then we find it ending on a dark note. So how you begin and how you end a chapter is important, so people read on. And this has got a very good end in that Butterbur, who's been the friendly one, he goes back to that note of suspicion, rousing suspicion in the Hobbits that we had with Harry by saying, I hope you don't mind, there's something I should have told you. So we go back to this sense of being unnerved and the reminder that something dangerous is hovering, that even old Butterbur has something that he needs to confess and admit. So, of course, you're going to turn the page and find out what both Strider and Butterbur want to say to the Hobbits. But we are going to leave it there. Notice that Merry is not mentioned. So the attentive reader will have ticking away in their mind that, where's Merry? And again, we're going to have to wait to find out in the next chapter.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.